The voicemail wasn't filled with panic or begging, it wasn't choked with screaming. It held something far more disturbing, a breath being taken from someone who still wanted to live. Not a sharp gasp, not a cry for help, just one soft, crushed exhale, like the last bit of air being squeezed out of a body that refused to give up. That tiny sound carried the weight of a future being erased. In that faint breath, you can feel someone fighting without arms, without words, without time. There were no footsteps, no breaking, no violence recorded, only the forced pause of life being interrupted. That single exhale ended plans, ended milestones, ended a wedding dress still waiting on a hanger. A whole lifetime collapsed without a scream. It's terrifying how a person can disappear without leaving a struggle behind, how a life can be taken with quiet, cruel precision, leaving only air pressed through collapsing lungs. Weeks of planning, years of dreams, gone, sealed inside one sound too small to save her and too real to ignore. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Lauren Mitchell's world wasn't chaotic. It wasn't careless. Her life was designed with sharp lines, precise plans, and purposeful structure. She shaped her future with the same certainty she used to shape buildings on paper. She was only 25, already designing affordable housing that she dreamed would change her city. Every room in her tiny Des Moines apartment mirrored her ambition. Her drafting table stayed angled exactly at 30 degrees for comfort. Books were sorted by size and subject. Color swatches pinned to her wall formed a clean gradient, untouched by mess or hesitation. Everything made sense. Everything followed a clean path forward, until someone stepped into that perfect symmetry and removed her from it, like erasing a main line off a blueprint. Her engagement ring rested on her finger, small but meaningful, a promise that spring would bring a wedding, a home, and a future she earned through hard work. But that future ended inside 3 seconds of stolen breath, recorded by mistake on her fiancé's voicemail. A life built with plans disappeared without warning, without a fight, without even a full scream, ripped away with quieter force than most people use, shutting a door. Subscribe so you never overlook the danger hidden in plain sight. If you ignore stories like this, who protects you when it's your turn? Just hours before she faded from her own future, Lauren was planning joy, not anxiety, not danger. Joy. She had been finalizing the guest list for her engagement party. Her mother had already picked out a soft white cardigan for her to wear over her dress, simple, warm, and elegant. Lauren laughed when she tried it on, spinning in the mirror, teasing that she'd look too cozy to say yes. That cardigan would become the most important missing object in Iowa. She and Julian, her fiancé, had argued playfully over appetizers. He wanted fancy. She wanted something anyone could afford. She wasn't building a wedding for show, the same way she wasn't designing buildings for profit. Everything in her life was practical, thoughtful, built with compassion. And that's why what happened next hits like emotional whiplash. A life filled with purpose doesn't disappear. It isn't something that just stops. But hers did not, with alarms, not with a fight, but with a breath caught on voicemail while she tried opening her own door. One moment she's planning marriage. The next, the world continues without her, like she never walked through that doorway at all. Julian didn't think much of it at first. Just a late-night voicemail after a long shift. He pressed play expecting Lauren's voice, maybe a reminder, maybe a joke, maybe a tired goodnight. Instead, he heard fumbling, a key struggling in a lock, metal scraping against metal. Then that terrible sound, a breath forced out of someone who wasn't expecting violence. It was too short to understand, too quiet to process. 3 seconds, then silence. He stared at the phone, confused, replaying it twice, thinking it was nothing, just clumsy noise. Pocket accident. Nothing worth worrying about at 10:45 p.m. That voicemail sat there as he brushed his teeth, as he microwaved leftover dinner, as he slept. He had no clue that while he dreamt of their future together, the only proof of her last moment was sitting inside his voicemail box. Unheard, unrecognized, unprotected. It wasn't just a message. It was a final breath begging to be noticed. And he dismissed it like background noise because nobody warns you when your last chance to save someone sounds ordinary. Tomorrow would expose the cost of assuming nothing is wrong. Detective Harlan Cobb stepped into Lauren Mitchell's apartment and felt it instantly. Wrongness that couldn't be explained by sight alone. The door hung slightly off its latch, not enough to break but enough to unsettle. Julian's keys still dangled on the hook untouched. The apartment looked untouched, clean, normal. But that normality screamed that something had been stolen, and it wasn't money or possessions. No furniture was overturned, no drawers were emptied, no broken locks, shattered glass, or signs of struggle. Cobb moved carefully across the room, noting each detail. A chair angled perfectly under the drafting table. A cup of half-drunk coffee still waiting for someone to return. The air smelled faintly of paper and wax from Lauren's design tools. The only remnants of human presence. It was a home frozen in time, yet life had been violently removed from it. Every step Cobb took echoed too loudly in the quiet apartment. The geometry of Lauren's space, precise, orderly, safe, had been violated in a way that didn't leave a trace, except for the subtle sense of absence. He glanced around at the walls, the shelves, the neatly stacked papers. Nothing. And yet everything was wrong. Every careful arrangement, every aligned book, every pinned color swatch, they now felt like a cruel setup. A stage for someone who had vanished. The detective took out his notebook. He didn't need to write down fingerprints or footprints yet. He had to record the way order itself had been fractured. The tiniest irregularity might hold the answer. Cobb knew, deep down, that the first 3 seconds of a voicemail, and this, still silent apartment, were connected 2 pieces of evidence separated by fear, absence, and time. Before moving on, notice the air of tension. Nothing is broken, yet everything is wrong. This is the beginning of uncovering a truth hidden in plain sight. Inside the apartment, time had paused as if Lauren herself had stepped out for a brief errand that would never end. The coffee machine sat cold, a faint scent of ground still lingering. Her half-finished sketchbook remained open. Sketches of low-income housing sprawled across the page lines that once represented hope, now hauntingly frozen. Every object reflected her absence. A chair tucked neatly under her drafting table. Books stacked by size and subject. A calendar marked with deadlines. Wedding preparations. And small celebrations remained untouched. Even the glow of the street lamp outside spilled across the hardwood floors, like a silent witness, illuminating the void she had left behind. Her 1985 Chevy Nova rested obediently in its usual spot outside, an anchor to a world that had not yet realized it had been broken. Cobb noted the apartment's clean order, realizing the missing element was not chaos, but life. No struggle, no footprints, no overturned furniture. Only the silence of a person who had vanished without a trace. This stillness pressed on the detectives' minds. Each step through the apartment was cautious, deliberate, yet the sense of wrongness grew heavier. The air itself seemed altered, as if someone had moved through it, leaving nothing but absence. Cobb's eyes scanned the apartment, looking for anything that might hint at what had occurred. Every corner, every shelf, every drawer whispered the same message. She was taken from a world that hadn't noticed her leaving until it was too late. The apartment, perfectly preserved, had become a museum of loss. And yet, hidden within that preservation, a single anomaly awaited, something so small it could easily be overlooked. But it would eventually reshape the course of the investigation. The only thing out of place in Lauren Mitchell's apartment wasn't valuable. It wasn't money, jewelry, or electronics. It was a white cardigan, folded neatly over the chair she had used to sketch her latest designs. Detective Cobb stared at the empty space. The cardigan had been small, ordinary, yet its absence felt like a scream in a silent room. Why take clothing and leave everything else untouched? The question gnawed at him. Whoever had been here didn't need possessions. They wanted control, precision, the subtle power of removing someone from their own life without drawing attention. Julian Pierce, her fiancé, had no explanation. He admitted to checking the apartment briefly after the voicemail, noticing nothing, assuming she had gone out. That single, missing cardigan now felt like a symbol of a future stolen. A simple object marking the line between life and disappearance. The detectives moved carefully, examining Lauren's desk, the drafting tools, the piles of papers. Everything else was intact, the lines of her world still perfectly drawn, except for the cardigan, gone without a trace. It was a quiet absence, a single item that carried a psychological weight far beyond its material value. Cobb made a mental note. The small, deliberate removal of something personal often pointed to someone known, or someone with a very specific plan. It wasn't random, and it wasn't careless. At that moment, the apartment whispered a chilling possibility. She hadn't walked away on her own. The missing cardigan, the open door, the untouched apartment, they were pieces of a puzzle too precise to ignore. The stage was set, the first tangible clue had quietly emerged, and the detectives knew the tiniest details would eventually expose the truth. Cobb crouched near the baseboard, where the door met the floor. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The apartment had been undisturbed for hours, yet something microscopic and out of place caught his eye. A faint smudge of reddish-brown clay, almost invisible to anyone not looking closely. It was a color that didn't belong in the apartment, not on the polished wood floor, not in the neat patterns of Lauren's workspace. No trace of construction, no paint, no dust. Yet here was this anomaly, subtle and quiet, as if it were trying to hide in plain sight. Cobb touched it lightly with a gloved finger. Its texture was fine, almost powdery, leaving behind the faintest trace on his glove. This tiny smudge carried an enormous implication. Someone had been inside. Someone had moved carefully, leaving almost nothing behind except this imperceptible fingerprint of another life intersecting with Lauren's own. It was so small it could have been missed entirely, overlooked by anyone untrained. But Cobb felt the weight of it immediately. He turned back to the apartment, scanning the perfect order of furniture, books, and papers. Every aligned object seemed to accentuate the presence of that tiny, foreign speck, a silent reminder that the most important clues often hide in the smallest details. If this were your home, would you notice the smallest detail? This smudge, nearly invisible, would eventually change everything about the investigation, connecting a quarter-century-old mystery to the moment when Lauren Mitchell's life was abruptly stolen. Cobb knew that the answers weren't in screams or chaos, they were in the quiet, unnoticed evidence left behind. Julian Pierce sat in the dim light of his living room, the phone cradled in his hand. The 3-second voicemail looped again and again. The sound was brief, a key fumbling in a lock, a sharp intake of breath, then silence. It was almost nothing. He shook his head. It had to be nothing. When the police arrived, they listened to the clip. Cobb and his team had heard worse, they claimed. Probably a pocket dial, one officer suggested. Trivial. Accidental. Yet Julian could feel a tension tightening in his chest. Something about that short, fleeting sound gnawed at him. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a technical error. Something had shifted, and he couldn't articulate why the sound of Lauren's last moment terrified him even before he realized it. Detectives began to watch him closely. Every glance, every hesitation, every pause in speech became data. Julian recounted his evening, his late work hours at the gallery, and the normal rhythm of his night. But the police, already tuned to the narrative of intimate access, started seeing shadows where none existed. That tiny voicemail, ignored, dismissed, now became the first thread of suspicion woven against him. The briefest noise, a mere exhalation, had unexpectedly transformed into evidence against him, not for what it revealed, but for what it failed to reveal immediately. This is how ordinary moments become extraordinary under scrutiny, how a life's tiny details, once overlooked, can unravel public perception, and how innocence can be mistaken for calculation. Julian's calmness became a focal point. To him, It was grief measured in quiet steps and careful words. To the detectives, it looked like calculation. Every answer he gave was precise. Every pause, intentional. He didn't sob uncontrollably. He didn't collapse. He was too composed, too collected. Detective Cobb noted it immediately. Most people react to trauma with panic, he muttered, watching Julian describe the voicemail, the apartment, and Lauren's absence. This man seems almost detached. Questions came in rapid succession, trying to pry cracks in a facade that was only his way of coping. Every detail of his night, down to the minute, was repeated and verified by colleagues. Yet the perception of calm continued to breed suspicion. Friends and family noticed it too. A cousin whispered that Julian didn't seem human that night, that his reaction was off. The police seized on these remarks, layering them over a narrative already primed for judgment. The world was ready to believe calm was guilt. Julian understood none of this at the time. He felt a hollow ache, knowing Lauren had vanished, and yet that ache became a lens through which others would see him as a suspect. His rational composure, the very thing keeping him functional, was twisted into evidence of deceit. It was a paradox. The more he tried to survive his own grief, the more he appeared dangerous to others. In that quiet apartment, amidst Lauren's absence and the voicemail replaying like a pulse, he became the first suspect in the eyes of everyone except the detectives who truly knew him. The tension had shifted. It was no longer just about Lauren's disappearance. It was about whether perception could convict someone before the truth even had a chance. Detectives turned their attention to Lauren and Julian's relationship. On the surface, it seemed flawless. Shared dreams, engagement rings exchanged, future plans mapped out. But the investigators weren't looking at love. They were searching for motives hidden in the cracks of perfection. A minor disagreement surfaced. Lauren had declined a job offer out of state to stay in Des Moines for Julian. What had been a simple discussion between two people who cared about each other became, in the eyes of the police, a potential trigger for violence. Every argument, every hesitation, every disagreement, normal friction in a committed relationship, was now twisted into a reason he might have harmed her. Detectives asked questions that Julian had never considered relevant. Did he ever feel frustrated? Did he argue about small things? Did he want her to leave or stay? Each question, though routine to them, felt invasive to Julian. Each answer scrutinized, recorded, and interpreted as evidence. Friends and neighbors were contacted. Every interaction Julian had with Lauren in the weeks prior was analyzed. Casual moments, a playful tease, a disagreement over dinner were now reframed as tension points. The investigators weren't just piecing together a timeline. They were constructing a narrative of suspicion out of ordinary life. Julian's grief became a spectacle. Tears withheld were considered calculated. Moments of composure were deemed cold. The detectives, the media, and the community all contributed to a fog of judgment that made it harder to see truth from perception. What had once been private love now became a public lens for suspicion. In this first investigation stage, the reality of loss collided with the imagination of guilt, and Julian found himself trapped between being a worried fiancé and a suspect in the eyes of everyone watching. By now, the tension had shifted from Lauren's absence to Julian's presence, or, more accurately, how he was perceived. The detective's scrutiny, combined with neighbors' whispers and media speculation, painted him as the calm suspect in a chaotic situation. Every measured response, every controlled breath, became a piece of evidence, whether it belonged there or not. The public debate quietly took hold. Was Julian's composure a sign of guilt or simply shock? People argued in hushed tones and online boards alike, dissecting body language, analyzing speech patterns, and projecting their assumptions onto a man whose life had just been upended. Cobb recognized the danger of perception shaping reality. The closer someone is to the tragedy, the harder it is to maintain innocence in others' eyes. Meanwhile, Julian replayed that 3-second voicemail in his mind. Each iteration of the key's clatter, each sharp intake of breath, Each pause of silence they now seemed heavier. The apartment, the missing cardigan, the unanswered questions. They pressed against him, not physically but psychologically. He became aware that even ordinary grief could be misread as calculated intent. The morning after the voicemail became public, Des Moines awoke to a storm of speculation. Headlines splashed across local papers. Fiancé in question. Who knew Lauren Mitchell best? And calm, or calculated. Julian Pierce. Under scrutiny. News anchors dissected every detail of Julian's behavior, framing ordinary grief as potential guilt. Television reports replayed the 3-second voicemail endlessly. That brief, sharp intake of breath, once dismissed, was now presented as proof of something sinister, though no evidence yet supported such claims. Journalists speculated about motives, casting shadows where none existed. Social conversations mimicked the media. Whispers in grocery stores, murmurs in offices, and conversations at church framed Julian as the man who might have betrayed the woman he loved. The effect was immediate. Julian became less a person mourning a fiancé and more a symbol of suspicion. The public, hungry for answers, filled in the gaps themselves. Each carefully composed sentence of his interviews was picked apart, analyzed, and portrayed as cold or detached. The line between observation and judgment blurred. Detective Cobb observed it silently, noting how quickly perception could become conviction. The real danger wasn't evidence, it was the narrative, built by those eager to define guilt without facts. Julian, who had been blindsided by Lauren's disappearance, now faced a second, more terrifying phenomenon: the weight of a community ready to condemn him. The headlines didn't just report the story. They shaped it, transforming a man's private agony into public scrutiny, a courtroom of rumor without a trial. The tension in Des Moines didn't remain confined to headlines. It seeped into streets, homes, and workplaces. Neighbors who once exchanged casual greetings now paused, their eyes scanning Julian with unspoken questions. Conversations about Lauren's disappearance were filled with speculation, judgment, and fear. Everyone wondered if the man next door could be hiding a secret. Julian, already struggling with grief, felt the weight of this collective suspicion. Friends hesitated to call or visit. Colleagues offered condolences that felt measured, their words carrying subtle doubt. At every corner, at every public appearance, he sensed invisible eyes questioning his integrity, his calmness, his very humanity. Community meetings about Lauren's disappearance turned tense. Volunteers and neighbors shared theories, each one building on the last, and each one placing Julian closer to blame. A minor disagreement he had with Lauren weeks prior, a simple conversation about her declining a job out of state, was dissected, exaggerated, and morphed into a motive in the court of public opinion. Even casual encounters became tests. A passerby might whisper, a friend might hesitate. Julian experienced the slow, suffocating spread of paranoia. It wasn't violent, but it was relentless. Fear of the unknown, coupled with media pressure, created a pervasive sense of threat, turning ordinary citizens into judges and jurors. Detective Cobb watched, silently, recognizing the danger of perception overriding fact. Julian's life had become a reflection of the city's fear, his grief twisted into evidence by those who feared the worst. The line between truth and rumor had blurred. In a town gripped by suspicion, everyone became complicit in the narrative, even if unintentionally. And in that blurred line, Julian's innocence hung by a thread, waiting for evidence to either confirm or absolve him. Detectives focused once again on Julian's relationship with Lauren, this time magnifying the smallest details. A disagreement that might have passed unnoticed between most couples became a potential trigger for violence in the eyes of investigators. Julian's decision to support Lauren staying in Des Moines rather than taking a job out of state was reframed as possessiveness. Every exchanged word, every minor disagreement, was dissected under scrutiny. Friends and acquaintances, unknowingly contributing to the narrative, recalled ordinary arguments, a comment about a missed gallery opening, a difference in architectural opinions, and their memories were twisted into evidence. Julian's private grief, his shock, and his attempts to cope became proof of calculation rather than pain. This distortion wasn't intentional, at least not consciously, but the effect was devastating. Ordinary behavior, human reactions, and love expressed through patience were all reframed as suspicious. The more the investigation and community pressed, the more Julian's life resembled a trial before a jury of public opinion. Detective Cobb recognized the peril. Small human flaws, trivial conflicts, even normal emotions, could now be read as motive. In a world hungry for answers, the lines between reality, rumor, and imagination blurred, leaving Julian trapped. The stage was set for the public to not only judge but to convict emotionally before a single piece of concrete evidence emerged. It was a cruel lesson in how perception can weaponize human relationships, turning ordinary love and grief into a story of potential betrayal. By this point, Julian's life had become a cautionary tale of how rumors and perception can destroy reputations. The media amplified every detail. The community scrutinized every action, and even minor personal conflicts were twisted into potential motive. In Des Moines, it was no longer just about Lauren's disappearance. It was about how quickly society can assign guilt without proof. Neighbors whispered, colleagues questioned, and friends hesitated. Every action Julian took was analyzed, every emotion misinterpreted. Calmness became suspicious. Grief became coldness. Ordinary choices became evidence. The lesson was clear. In a world driven by speculation, perception can be as lethal as truth. Subscribe before a rumor in your life becomes your conviction. Des Moines became a city plastered with Lauren Mitchell's face. Every lamppost, storefront, and bus stop displayed the same photograph. Her vibrant smile frozen in time. Eyes full of life, framed by the stark text, "Have you seen Lauren?" Her father, August Mitchell, coordinated the campaign personally, driven by a desperate hope that someone, anyone, would remember something that could lead to her return. The posters weren't just notices. They became a constant reminder of absence, of a life interrupted. People couldn't walk a block without seeing her face. It haunted the city quietly but persistently, imprinting the tragedy on the collective consciousness of Des Moines. Local businesses helped by printing extra copies, volunteers glued posters on walls, and concerned citizens placed them in unexpected places, telephone poles, park benches, even inside library windows. Each poster was a silent plea, a message that the city was united in grief and urgency. For the community, it was a call to action. Residents could no longer ignore the disappearance. The posters served as a visual manifestation of hope and anxiety combined, a reminder that Lauren was missing and that someone had to act. The city, previously routine and predictable, was now marked by vigilance and sorrow. Every passerby, every commuter, every child walking home from school was confronted with the abrupt absence of a young woman whose life had once been ordinary, planned, and full of promise. Even as hope propelled action, it carried the weight of desperation, impatience, and fear. Each poster was a reminder that time was slipping away, and the search for Lauren was becoming more urgent by the day. With the city plastered in Lauren's image, volunteers mobilized as if called to battle, forming a grieving army determined to recover what had vanished. Parks, riversides, abandoned railway lines, and alleys became zones of meticulous search. Every stone overturned, every brush moved, carried the weight of hope and fear intertwined. Parents, college students, and retirees combed the neighborhoods. Their hands shook from the cold and the tension, their eyes scanning every shadow, every crevice. Each person carried a copy of Lauren's photograph, repeating her name like a mantra. Lauren Mitchell. Lauren Mitchell. The rhythm of the search became a ritual of both grief and determination. Despite their efforts, the days yielded nothing. Every lead ended in dead ends, every tip dissolved into uncertainty. Volunteers returned home exhausted, hearts heavy, yet they came back the next day. It was a cycle of hope, disappointment, and relentless commitment. The city's collective pulse felt uneasy, raw, and painfully aware of the invisible hand of tragedy. The community's energy created a vivid contrast with Julian Pierce, who moved through the same streets as an invisible presence, while others acted outwardly, driven by emotion and duty. Julian felt trapped within an invisible cage. Each search party, each poster, each whispered speculation reminded him that the world had already started judging him. And yet, amidst the frustration, there was a faint undercurrent of optimism. Each passerby believed that somewhere in the city, a detail, a memory, or a trace would reveal itself, bringing Lauren back. But with every fruitless effort, the feeling of absence deepened, a haunting reminder that some truths remain hidden, even when a city searches with unwavering determination. As the city rallied, Julian Pierce felt increasingly invisible, a specter among the living. Every corner he turned, every street he walked, whispers followed him, some subtle, some pointed. People's eyes lingered, judgment unspoken but palpable. Even those who knew him best began to hesitate, unsure of what to believe. The grief that had once been private now became an open display of suspicion, and Julian's life shrank into shadows of scrutiny. Volunteering alongside others searching for Lauren, Julian became a figure of tension. His presence was noted, yet conversations faltered when he approached. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made, was scrutinized through the lens of a community desperate for closure. The calmness he tried to maintain was misread as detachment, his careful composure as potential guilt. This dual existence, mourning openly while being silently condemned, isolated Julian further. Friends, concerned yet wary, offered polite distance. Family members of volunteers and neighbors cast glances filled with unspoken judgment. The city, united in grief, simultaneously alienated the man closest to Lauren, turning him into a living shadow of suspicion. Detective Cobb recognized the psychological toll. Julian's isolation wasn't just a consequence of tragedy, it was a byproduct of human fear and the power of perception. The community's collective search for answers inadvertently transformed an innocent man into a ghost, navigating streets filled with both hope and accusation. Even as volunteers pressed on, Julian's experience was a cautionary tale that absence is felt not only by the missing, but by those unjustly judged, who are left to wander through the haze of suspicion while the real answers remain hidden. Amid the chaos of searches and the rising tension in the city, forensic teams finally examined the tiny, reddish-brown smear found on the baseboard of Lauren's apartment. The kaolinite smudge, barely noticeable to the naked eye, had lingered in the background of the investigation for months. At first glance, it seemed insignificant, a minuscule stain with no apparent connection to the crime. Laboratory technicians ran standard tests, expecting the results to confirm what everyone feared, that it was just ordinary industrial clay, a meaningless trace that offered no direction. Initial reports labeled it untraceable. Detectives filed it away alongside other minor details, unable to link it to a suspect or location. The smear seemed destined to remain a silent witness, its story buried under years of frustration and dead ends. Yet the smudge held potential, subtle yet powerful. Its presence at the scene was anomalous, a color and texture that didn't belong in the carefully ordered apartment. Detective Cobb, still haunted by the impossibility of Lauren's disappearance, noted its quiet defiance. Though small, it hinted at a world unseen, a detail overlooked in the rush to judgment. Though deemed meaningless at the time, this microscopic fragment would eventually serve as a linchpin. For now, it remained a subtle curiosity, a clue that seemed to vanish in the enormity of grief and suspicion. Its unremarkable appearance masked its extraordinary potential, quietly waiting for technology and perseverance to uncover the truth decades later. The city moved forward in search and despair, unaware that a trace as small as a smear of clay might one day reveal the answer to the mystery that had haunted them for years. Julian's isolation and the city's frantic search created a tension that went beyond physical absence. It reflected the human tendency to judge without proof. The community's eyes, heavy with fear and grief, had already decided that answers must exist somewhere, And if not, someone must be at fault. Julian lived this truth daily, navigating streets and search efforts, while being silently condemned for a crime he did not commit. This moment resonates because it mirrors experiences many of us have faced in life. Have you ever been accused, questioned, or mistrusted without evidence? The emotional weight can be suffocating, as those around you react based on assumption rather than reality. Julian's experience is a stark reminder that the human mind often fills gaps with suspicion when faced with uncertainty. Have you ever been judged without proof? Share your experience in the comments below. After months of exhaustive searching, meticulous interviews, and endless analysis, the Des Moines Police Department reached a painful conclusion. Lauren Mitchell's disappearance was officially classified as a cold case. The initial urgency faded into bureaucratic terminology, a sterile label that failed to capture the anguish of her family or the weight of the unanswered questions. Detective Harlan Cobb, once determined and tireless, felt the sting of professional frustration. This case, unlike others he had solved, resisted closure with a quiet, maddening precision. Every lead that seemed promising vanished. Every tip dissolved into dead ends. He carried the file home, often staring at it late into the night, haunted by the silence of what could not be solved. For the Mitchell family, the cold designation was more than administrative. It was a final, unbearable reminder of absence. Their grief, already heavy, became a quiet torment, a lingering ache compounded by the official declaration that, for now, no answers would come. Julian Pierce, too, felt the invisible weight of public scrutiny, compounded by the impossibility of resolution. Being cleared of suspicion didn't erase the shadow that had fallen across his life. The declaration of a cold case created an eerie shift. The city moved on, volunteers returned to normal routines, and local media turned their attention elsewhere. But for those closest to Lauren, the absence was loud, persistent, and deafening. The silence surrounding the case became almost tangible, a witness in its own right, reminding everyone that not all questions are answered, and not all evil is immediately recognized. Even as the file was shelved, the echoes of uncertainty remained. Every unanswered call, every fruitless search, every glance at the untouched posters served as a constant reminder that justice, like truth, sometimes waits decades to reveal itself. The 3-second voicemail, brief, cryptic, and unnervingly silent after a sharp intake of breath, became a haunting relic of the night Lauren vanished. Initially dismissed as a simple mistake or pocket dial, its significance only grew as weeks turned into months. The looping audio echoed through the precinct, like a tombstone carved from sound itself, a reminder of absence, uncertainty, and the unanswered questions surrounding her disappearance. Detectives replayed the clip endlessly, searching for clues hidden within the fleeting seconds. Every subtle sound, the fumble of a key, the gasp was dissected, analyzed, and theorized about. Yet the voicemail stubbornly offered no explanation, no resolution, only the piercing silence that followed Lauren's final, captured breath. It became a psychological marker for the case, embodying all the frustration, fear, and grief of those trying to make sense of a tragedy that had no immediate answers. For Julian, hearing the voicemail repeated in police review sessions and in news snippets was a constant, private torment. Every replay reminded him of the night he could do nothing, of the public suspicion that had shadowed him, and of the impossibility of reclaiming what had been lost. It transformed from a simple recording into a sonic tombstone, memorializing a life abruptly interrupted and a community's collective anxiety. Even the public, when made aware of the voicemail, felt its weight. It symbolized the finality of disappearance without violence, the horror of absence, and the helplessness of loved ones who could only listen. The sonic loop became a metaphor for frozen time, a moment suspended, endlessly replayed, and never resolved. As months became years, the urgency surrounding Lauren Mitchell's disappearance slowly faded from the public eye. Posters lost their vibrancy, volunteers returned to everyday routines, and conversations about her case became quieter, shorter, and increasingly rare. What was once a citywide tragedy gradually became a background murmur, a story relegated to memory rather than immediate concern. This shift, however, didn't erase the injustice. Julian Pierce remained under the weight of suspicion despite his official clearance. The public's fading attention did not equate to fairness. Rather, injustice had become normalized. Society had moved on while a man who had loved and lost still carried the invisible mark of blame. Every glance, every whispered rumor, reminded him that being innocent was not enough to free him from judgment. Detectives, too, felt the change. Their efforts, once fervent, slowed under bureaucratic pressure and the natural passage of time. The case file, thick with notes, sketches, and inconclusive evidence, became a symbol of frustration. The community's collective grief waned, and with it, the pressure to act. Yet those who remembered Lauren did so with a quiet ache, aware that truth often waits in silence for years before resurfacing. The normalization of injustice served as a sobering reflection. Communities can forget, but memories of loss linger for those directly affected. Julian's life, shadowed by public perception, underscored how absence and silence can be weaponized by fear, suspicion, and apathy. When society moves on too quickly, the innocent continue to suffer, and the unresolved becomes quietly tolerated. Even as the city's attention drifted away, Lauren Mitchell's case remained a warning that danger is often quiet, hidden in plain sight. Threats don't always announce themselves with noise or chaos. They can linger where we least expect them, unnoticed, until it's too late. Patterns dismissed as irrelevant today may hold the key to truth tomorrow. The smallest detail can become the deciding clue. The kaolinite smear, once overlooked, would one day lead investigators to the person responsible. This is a lesson for all of us. Paying attention can make the difference between safety and regret. Don't miss cases that hide danger and quiet people. Subscribe now. Danger isn't always obvious. Ignoring warnings or believing that tragedies happen only to others leaves us unprepared. Awareness is the shield that keeps us vigilant, the knowledge that prevents complacency. Ignoring crimes doesn't make you safe, it makes you unprepared. Subscribe. Even in the silence of a cold case, there is a lesson. Observe, question, and never assume safety where warning signs may be subtle. The world often hides threats behind ordinary facades, and the only defense is attention and action. 25 years had passed, and the Lauren Mitchell case lay dormant, its file thick with frustration and unanswered questions. In 2018, a fresh set of eyes arrived in Des Moines. Detective Rhea Nolan, sharp, methodical, and unburdened by the weight of past assumptions, was tasked with reopening the investigation. Unlike her predecessors, she relied not on instinct alone, but on logic, precision, and the possibilities offered by modern technology. Nolan began by reviewing every detail of the original reports, the interviews, the small inconsistencies, and the faintest traces of evidence that had been dismissed. She understood that in cases this old, time itself could be an ally. Patterns once invisible could now be revealed through forensic advancements and analytical software. Every photograph, every note, and every minute recording was re-examined with the aim of uncovering what had been missed. The most intriguing piece of evidence remained the tiny kaolinite smear discovered in Lauren's apartment. A fragment so small, it might have seemed inconsequential, yet Nolan recognized its potential. In an era where scientific precision had leapt decades ahead, a microscopic clue could be the bridge between mystery and resolution. She treated the file not as a story of grief, but as a puzzle of logic. Each unanswered question was a challenge. Who could access the material? Why was it present? And could it tie a living person to the long-forgotten crime scene? Nolan's approach was relentless, her focus unshakable. She knew that decades of silence and dust could be overturned not by emotion, but by meticulous reasoning and modern investigative tools. The city that had moved on, forgetting a tragedy it once mourned, would soon witness the resurgence of a case that refused to die. The clay, seemingly insignificant, was about to speak with a clarity no one could have imagined. Detective Nolan turned her attention to the kaolinite smear. the tiny trace of clay that had haunted the original investigation. In 1993, it had been labeled industrial grade, common, and ultimately unhelpful. Now, with modern tools and scientific methods, she understood that no detail was ever truly meaningless. The smear, invisible to the untrained eye, was a riddle left behind by someone who had believed it would never matter. Careful analysis began with a high-powered microscope, followed by advanced geochemical tests. Each particle revealed layers of information, mineral composition, trace elements, subtle impurities elements that could point to a specific source. Nolan knew that the clay's fingerprint could be as unique as a person's, capable of tracing a connection across decades. The investigation team ran the sample through mass spectrometry and X-ray diffraction. Data poured in, numbers and spectra painting a story that human memory could not. The tiny clay residue, once dismissed, began to speak volumes. It was no longer generic, it was distinctive, carrying with it the secrets of its origin. This realization shifted the tone of the investigation. A piece of dust, overlooked for 25 years, was now a key. The microscopic smear could point to a location, a time frame, even a person who had touched it. The case, frozen in time, was showing signs of life again. The detective's mind raced as possibilities emerged. Whoever had left this trace had been careful, but not careful enough. Nolan's methodical approach allowed her to treat the clay not as a passive clue, but as an active witness, waiting patiently for technology to decode its story. The clay wasn't common after all, but we'll prove it soon. With the kaolinite now under the scrutiny of 21st century science, Detective Nolan's investigation entered a new dimension. Advanced forensic technology allowed her to examine the clay in ways impossible in 1993. Spectral analysis, X-ray diffraction, and mass spectrometry revealed the mineral's hidden signature tiny impurities and rare earth elements that traced the material to a highly specific source. This breakthrough transformed the case. A smear once considered meaningless now held a story. Each particle of clay became a piece of evidence linking the crime scene to the materials and tools used by a skilled craftsman. Nolan's team mapped the unique geochemical fingerprint, comparing it to historical data from local quarries and specialized construction suppliers. The painstaking process illuminated a network of potential sources, narrowing the field to those who could have had access to such material in the early 1990 seconds. The detective realized the implications. The kaolinite could not have ended up at Lauren Mitchell's apartment by accident. Its presence indicated knowledge, intention, and proximity. Someone had left this mark deliberately, trusting that it would remain unnoticed, a silent signature of the person responsible. Nolan's meticulous work highlighted a truth often overlooked in cold cases. Technology remembers what humans forget. What once seemed like dust, a trace without meaning, could now pierce decades of silence. Every mineral impurity told a story. Every spectral line connected the past to the present. The case file, dormant for 25 years, was no longer a relic. It had become a roadmap. And within the tiny smear of clay lay the promise of answers that had been waiting patiently for decades. The clay wasn't common after all. Its secrets would soon reveal the person behind Lauren's disappearance. With the forensic analysis complete, Detective Nolan now had a lead sharper than anything the case had seen in decades. The kaolinite's unique signature allowed her to narrow the investigation to a very small circle of individuals who had access to the material, in the right location, and during the correct time frame. What had been a cold file, layered with dust and forgotten frustrations, now glimmered with possibility. Every name, every record, every connection was examined. Nolan cross-referenced employment histories, construction projects, and weekend work of anyone who might have handled such clay between 1991 and 1993. The meticulous cross-checking revealed patterns invisible to earlier investigators. The logic was simple. The person who had left the smear had a specific link to the material, the location, and the timing. The case was no longer abstract, it was tangible. With a trail that could lead to the truth, the city that had long stopped thinking about Lauren Mitchell would soon feel the shock of renewed attention. The cold case, silent for decades, was waking from its slumber. Nolan understood that even the smallest oversight in 1993 could now be exploited by modern analysis to reveal the criminal behind the crime. Every particle of clay was a witness, patiently waiting for science to listen. This was the moment where logic overrode uncertainty, and evidence replaced speculation. A silent clue, once invisible and meaningless, had become the key to unraveling the mystery. The kaolinite smear, dismissed for a quarter century, had finally spoken, pointing the way toward answers that had seemed impossible for 25 years. The clay wasn't common after all, and soon, it would expose the person responsible for Lauren Mitchell's disappearance. The tiny smear of clay that had once seemed insignificant was about to tell its story with startling clarity. Detective Nolan turned to geochemical fingerprinting, a technology that could analyze the chemical composition of minerals down to the smallest trace elements. This wasn't guesswork. Every particle of kaolinite carried a record of its origin, a mineral signature shaped by the earth and by human hands during processing. Through X-ray diffraction and mass spectrometry, the investigation team identified rare elements embedded in the clay bismuth, cerium, and subtle traces of other contaminants. These impurities weren't random. They were consistent with a specific geological deposit unique to a handful of locations. Nolan knew that this approach could narrow decades of uncertainty into a single, actionable lead. The forensic breakthrough illustrated the incredible precision of modern science. A substance once dismissed as generic industrial clay was no longer just a residue, it had become a witness. Each spectral line and chemical ratio told the story of a quarry, a production period, and, most importantly, access to the material. Nolan realized that science could now reach across 25 years, pulling evidence from obscurity and connecting it to the person who had left it behind. It was the kind of revelation that could never have been imagined in 1993. What had seemed impossible, the identification of a unique source for a microscopic smear, was now entirely within reach. The clay, silent and invisible for decades, was ready to speak louder than any witness ever could. The geochemical analysis revealed something remarkable. The kaolinite wasn't just ordinary clay. Its elemental composition matched deposits found within a 10-mile radius of a single quarry near Des Moines. The precision of modern forensic science had transformed an overlooked particle into a roadmap, pointing investigators toward a very specific geographic area. Detective Nolan reviewed historical records of the quarry's operations between 1991 and 1993. Only a handful of businesses and craftsmen had access to clay from that source, and the volume distributed during that period was carefully documented. The probability of someone outside this circle leaving the trace in Lauren Mitchell's apartment was virtually zero. This wasn't a coincidence. The clay's origin was a silent signature, a message the perpetrator had unknowingly left behind. With each cross-reference, the suspect pool began to shrink. Local contractors, restorers, and part-time stoneworkers who had bought or been supplied with material from the quarry were carefully analyzed. Work schedules, addresses, and projects were compared against Lauren's life and her apartment location. Every piece of information added another layer of pressure. The person responsible had to be both near Lauren and in contact with the material. The 10-mile radius might seem broad, but in forensic terms, it was incredibly limiting. It reduced decades of speculation to a manageable scope, allowing the investigation to focus on a handful of individuals who could possibly have left the trace. What had once been an unsolvable puzzle was now beginning to take shape, guided entirely by the clay and the technology that decoded it. The clay's origin was no accident. Its secrets would soon point directly to a person. The forensic data alone was striking, but when combined with timing, location, and access, the odds of an accidental presence became virtually impossible. Detective Nolan understood that the kaolinite smear wasn't random, it was deliberate. Whoever had left it had direct contact with the material, and with Lauren's environment. The statistical analysis began with the number of people who had access to the specific quarry clay between 1991 and 1993. 993. Then, their proximity to Ingersoll Avenue, Lauren's home, was mapped. Finally, work schedules and projects were compared to the day of her disappearance. Each filter drastically reduced the pool of possible suspects. What had once been dozens now became just a handful, and the probability of an outsider leaving the trace by coincidence was effectively zero. Nolan reviewed the numbers again. A microscopic particle of clay, measured in milligrams, had created a chain reaction that decades of human investigation could not. This tiny evidence item had survived the passage of time, weather, and oversight, but science had given it a voice, and that voice was pointing unerringly toward the guilty party. The implications were chilling. A single mistake, a trace left behind, could withstand 25 years of obscurity and finally identify the responsible individual. It was a reminder that even the smallest action can have enormous consequences, especially when combined with the unforgiving precision of modern forensic science. Detective Nolan now had a narrowed suspect pool and a path forward that had been unimaginable in the original investigation. The kaolinite, once dismissed as meaningless, had transformed the case from an unsolvable cold file into a pursuit with measurable probability and undeniable direction. The statistical odds make you wonder, can anyone truly hide from evidence forever? Comment your thoughts below. As the narrowed suspect pool came into focus, a pattern began to emerge, one that linked skill, access, and opportunity in a way no casual observer could anticipate. The kaolinite smear pointed not just to a location, but to someone who worked intimately with stone, clay, and restoration materials. It was the mark of a craftsman, someone whose hands had handled these materials repeatedly, unknowingly leaving traces behind. Detective Nolan cross-referenced every individual connected to the quarry, focusing on part-time restorers, stonecutters, and artisans who had worked near Ingersoll Avenue. Every project, every purchase, every connection was scrutinized. Slowly, the data pointed to one person whose work matched the clay's chemical signature, and whose proximity aligned with the timeline of Lauren Mitchell's disappearance. The evidence was no longer circumstantial, it was forensic inevitability. This realization marked a turning point. The investigation was no longer about searching a city full of possibilities. It had become a laser-focused pursuit of someone who had tried to blend seamlessly into ordinary life, hiding in plain sight. The microscopic clay smear, a fragment so small it could be dismissed, had become a spotlight exposing the invisible. Nolan understood the gravity. The perpetrator had thought the case would fade with time, that the traces of their crime would vanish. Science had other plans. The combination of technology, probability, and persistent inquiry meant the past could no longer shield the guilty. Every clay particle, every rare element, every statistical anomaly was a witness demanding acknowledgement. Technology remembers what killers hope time erases. Subscribe. Years of silence had allowed the world to forget, but the clay had not. As Detective Nolan traced the unique mineral signature, one name quietly rose above the rest: Quentin Bell. He had been a background figure, a drafting instructor whose life seemed ordinary, respectable, and unremarkable. Yet, the microscopic smear left behind in Lauren Mitchell's apartment had begun to tell a story no one could ignore. Bell's professional demeanor, his calm routine, and his unassuming presence had shielded him from suspicion for decades. He had blended seamlessly into the background, living a life that seemed too ordinary to harbor danger. But science had a way of speaking when words fail, and the clay fingerprint had whispered his name loud enough to reach Detective Nolan. The tension was immediate. A man long considered peripheral was now at the center of the investigation, not because of witness testimony or confession, but because a tiny fragment of mineral refused to lie. Each chemical element in the clay pointed to the workshops, the projects, and the hands of Quentin Bell. The quiet expert, previously invisible, was now illuminated in forensic detail. This revelation rippled through the team. The person who had seemed harmless, whose presence had faded from public memory, was suddenly unmistakably connected to one of Des Moines' most haunting mysteries. The calm surface of his life could no longer hide the evidence. Before we proceed, consider this. Have you ever overlooked someone who seemed ordinary, only to discover they held secrets that could change everything? Quentin Bell's alibi was solid on paper. For the night Lauren Mitchell vanished, he had records placing him elsewhere, surrounded by colleagues who vouched for his presence. On the surface, the case appeared unassailable. Yet, the forensic trail refused to be ignored. The microscopic kaolinite, a material that Bell had worked with repeatedly in his craft, connected him to the scene in a way his alibi never could. Detective Nolan reviewed the evidence with a sense of quiet urgency. Every shift, every batch of clay, every project he had touched. These traces now formed a timeline and geography that intersected with Lauren's final night. The physical proof was subtle but undeniable. A speck of clay, measured and analyzed decades later, tied Bell to her apartment in a way that witnesses and paperwork could not. The dissonance was unsettling. How could a man appear so ordinary, so trustworthy, and yet leave behind a fingerprint of guilt that time could not erase? This contradiction, the clean alibi versus the damning material evidence, was the core of the investigation. It revealed that danger often wears the mask of normalcy, that skill and precision could disguise malevolence, and that time does not erase truth. The realization weighed heavily. Bell had thought his life of routine and precision would protect him, that decades of obscurity would render the past irrelevant. But science had rewritten the rules. Even the most careful facade cannot erase the traces left behind by your actions. Consider the people around you. Could the quietest figure be hiding the greatest risk? Comment your thoughts below. Quentin Bell's weekday life was calm, predictable, and unremarkable. But on weekends, a different pattern emerged, one that would ultimately expose him. He worked part-time as a stone cutter and restorer, repairing old buildings and handling specialized clay materials just blocks away from Lauren Mitchell's apartment. Every weekend shift, every piece of stone and clay he touched, left traces that modern forensic technology could finally read. Detective Nolan's team mapped his projects against the timeline of Lauren's disappearance. The alignment was undeniable. The chemical signature in the kaolinite smear matched the clay Bell had used, down to rare contaminants found only in local quarries. It was a small, precise trail, but it led straight to him. What had once been dismissed as a generic material was now a forensic roadmap, pointing unerringly to a man who had appeared harmless for decades. The tension of this revelation was sharp. Bell's dual life, a normal, quiet instructor by day, a craftsman with potential access to Lauren by weekend, revealed how danger can hide in plain sight. He had not needed force or chaos. His knowledge of materials and proximity had been enough to leave an indelible mark, a trace that time could not erase. Every detail of his weekend work now mattered. Every project, every piece of clay, every drop of kaolinite became a silent witness, testifying against him long before any human eye suspected his involvement. This was the breakthrough that transformed the cold case into an active hunt. The quiet ones are often the most overlooked. Quentin Bell had spent decades blending into the background, presenting a facade of normalcy while leaving behind subtle traces that only persistent science could uncover. His calm demeanor, orderly life, and professional respectability had lulled everyone into a false sense of security. Yet, the evidence told a different story, a story of proximity, opportunity, and silent intent. Detective Nolan knew that the investigation had reached a critical moment. Bell's alibi was solid in the eyes of casual observers, but the forensic reality was inescapable. The microscopic clay smudge, a fragment so small it could have been dismissed, had persisted as a fingerprint of truth, revealing the calculated path of someone who had assumed invisibility would protect him. This subsection emphasizes a chilling truth. Evil does not always announce itself with noise or threats. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, disguised as competence, normalcy, or civility. The quiet expert, meticulous in craft and routine, can wield danger with precision, leaving behind evidence only the most patient and technologically advanced investigation can decode. The tension now shifted from uncertainty to inevitability. The pattern, once hidden, had become undeniable. Every piece of clay, every project, every interaction pointed to Bell, not just as a suspect, but as the architect of a long-hidden crime. With the quiet danger revealed, the stage was set for confrontation. The investigation had narrowed its focus to a single, inescapable truth. The person who seemed safest was the one who had left the clearest trace. The street was quiet, too quiet. At 6 a.m., the neighborhood stirred only with the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional chirp of a lone bird. In Waveland Park, the police unit moved with careful precision, each officer aware that decades of waiting had led to this moment. The air carried a tension so taut it seemed to vibrate. Every step they took was measured, every breath silent, yet the weight of anticipation pressed down like an invisible hand. Detective Nolan held the warrant firmly in her hand, her gaze fixed on the modest home ahead. Years of research, decades of cold leads, and countless hours of cross-referencing had narrowed the investigation to this doorstep. The target of that investigation, Quentin Bell, had lived a life of quiet normalcy, but normalcy had left a trace, a small fingerprint of guilt hidden in a smudge of clay. And now, the time had come for that trace to speak. Behind the closed door, the quiet of early morning mirrored the calm of Bell's life, a calm that had shielded him for decades. Yet outside, the storm of truth was waiting. Every officer knew the stakes. This was not just about bringing a case to closure. It was about exposing the person who had hidden in plain sight, whose expertise and patience had masked an act of violence. The moments stretched, measured by the careful ticking of a clock no one acknowledged, until one definitive action would shatter the morning stillness. The knock that had been rehearsed, anticipated, and dreaded was moments away. The officers approached the front door with deliberate steps, the morning chill cutting through the quiet. Every movement was calculated. Every sound could betray the tension that had been building for decades. Detective Nolan's hand hovered near the door, ready for the moment when years of evidence would finally meet the man behind the mask of normalcy. A single knock echoed through the house. Not loud, not hurried, just firm and purposeful. The sound resonated, breaking the stillness of the early hour, carrying with it the weight of 25 years of unanswered questions. It was the knock that transformed theory into reality, speculation into confrontation. Every second stretched, heavy with the gravity of what was about to unfold. Inside, Quentin Bell stirred. The sound of the knock did not startle him. Instead, it seemed to pierce a thin veil of routine he had maintained for decades. The quiet craftsman, the mild-mannered instructor, the man who had hidden behind schedules and projects, now faced the culmination of careful observation, scientific analysis, and patient police work. Outside, officers remained still, watching, waiting. The tension was thick, a silent pressure pressing on the shoulders of all present. One more heartbeat, one more breath, and the door would open, bringing with it a truth long concealed. Every eye focused on the front porch. The small smudge of clay, imperceptible to the untrained eye, had led to this exact moment. The invisible thread of evidence, once ignored and dismissed, had drawn a line straight to him, and now, that line was about to be followed to its conclusion. The door creaked open, revealing Quentin Bell standing exactly as he had every day for decades, calm, composed, and deceptively ordinary. His eyes met Detective Nolan's, unflinching, yet carrying the weight of someone who knew the truth was finally unavoidable. In a single, quiet sentence, he spoke, shattering the morning stillness. "It's about the clay, isn't it?" The words hung in the air, deceptively simple, yet loaded with confession. No theatrics, no hesitation, just acknowledgement. In that moment, the invisible thread of evidence became undeniable. The microscopic smudge, once overlooked, had guided the investigation to its destination. The man who had concealed his actions behind a life of routine and quiet expertise had revealed himself with a phrase that confirmed every suspicion. Detective Nolan and her team remained calm but alert, the weight of the moment pressing on them. Years of patient analysis, modern forensic technology, and relentless pursuit of detail had culminated in this instant. Every officer, every piece of evidence, every unanswered question had led here to a door opening and a single, chilling admission. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath. Neighbors, oblivious to the years of investigation, would never realize the quiet violence that had occurred just steps from their porches. Inside, the acknowledgement reshaped decades of uncertainty into a clear path forward. The invisible became visible, the hidden became known, and the silence of 25 years began to break. Only facts expose monsters. Subscribe for truth. Quentin Bell's calm demeanor did not falter as the officers presented the evidence piece by piece. The microscopic clay, traced to a quarry mere blocks from Lauren Mitchell's apartment, was no longer just a fragment. It was a fingerprint of guilt. Every project, every stone cut, every seemingly innocent act was suddenly part of a trail leading straight to him. Bell listened, acknowledging the truth with quiet precision. No outbursts, no excuses, just the subtle acceptance that the past had caught up. The confession had already begun with the simple acknowledgement of the clay, but now the forensic evidence left him no room to hide. The meticulous patterns of his life, once invisible, were now illuminated by science and patient investigation. Detective Nolan watched closely. Years of dedication, decades of cold leads, and relentless pursuit of detail had converged here. The quiet expert, the man who had seemed harmless and orderly, was unmasked not by luck or intuition, but by facts. Facts that persisted through time, unyielding, refusing to be ignored. Outside, the early morning sun began to pierce the horizon, casting light on a truth that had remained buried for a quarter century. The confrontation was not violent, it did not need to be. The weight of evidence, the inevitability of discovery, and the quiet acknowledgement of guilt spoke louder than any outburst could. This moment, tense and precise, was the pivot. The case was no longer theory or suspicion. It had become reality. Quentin Bell, the hidden craftsman of a long-forgotten crime, had been revealed. The path forward was clear. Justice, long delayed, was finally in reach. The stage was now set for the final chapters, where hidden evidence would be unearthed, and closure would come not with spectacle, but with undeniable truth. The morning light fell gently over Quentin Bell's rose garden, its blooms seemingly innocent, colorful, and fragrant. Yet, beneath this ordered beauty lay decades of concealment. Detective Nolan and her team moved carefully, aware that the seemingly tranquil garden had become the focal point of an investigation spanning 25 years. Every step on the soft soil was measured, every glance searching for the subtle clues that could finally deliver answers. With precision, officers began their careful excavation. The tools Bell had used, once ordinary, now revealed traces of clay traces that matched the smudge found in Lauren Mitchell's apartment all those years ago. Each shard of evidence confirmed the suspicions that had long lingered. This garden was more than a display of care and beauty. It was a deliberate shield for hidden truth. Then, beneath a particularly well-tended rose bush, the team uncovered the first tangible piece of closure. Lauren Mitchell's white cardigan, carefully wrapped in plastic sheeting, preserved just enough to confirm its identity. The garment, once missing and symbolic of Lauren's abrupt disappearance, had been buried with deliberate intent, concealed by the calm order of the garden above. The roses themselves seemed to bloom with quiet irony, their growth nourished by the very soil that had hidden decades of crime. What had been a symbol of peace and domestic tranquility had become a testament to concealment and pretense. The juxtaposition was stark, the life above thriving, while the truth below remained suppressed. For the investigators, this discovery was a culmination of patient, persistent effort. The hidden cardigan, combined with the clay-soaked tools, transformed decades of cold evidence into undeniable proof. The quiet garden, with its carefully nurtured beauty, had concealed one of the most meticulous attempts to erase a life. Should killers lose their grave rights and burial honors? Comment below and share your thoughts. As the excavation continued, Detective Nolan's team unearthed the tools Bell had used: chisels, hammers, and trowels, each caked in dried clay. The same kaolinite that had long taunted investigators in Lauren's apartment was present here in unmistakable quantities. Every instrument became a direct link between the crime scene and Bell's meticulously ordered life. The clay's presence confirmed what analysis had suggested. This was no random smudge. It was the signature of a man who had taken care to cover his tracks while leaving the barest trace behind. Each tool told a story of deliberate action, of someone who had allowed the passage of decades to mask his crime. The precision in the placement of the tools mirrored the care in the rest of Bell's life. Quiet, methodical, and seemingly innocuous. Nolan reflected on the irony. A man trained to teach, to guide, and to create had turned those same skills into a weapon of concealment. The evidence now in hand transformed speculation into proof. The garden, the tools, the clay all were part of a geometric pattern of deception. A hidden language written in soil and residue. Officers documented every piece meticulously, photographing the tools and clay for analysis. The forensic team would soon connect the remaining dots, but for Nolan, the emotional weight of this discovery was already profound. The cardigan had been hidden, yes, but so had the truth. And now, the tools provided the final corroboration of a long-pending accusation. Quentin Bell had acted with intention, and nothing in his orderly life could erase what had been done. The quiet garden, which had once symbolized routine and normalcy, now stood as a silent witness. Its beauty had protected a dark secret, but even roses, carefully tended and nurtured, cannot obscure the truth forever. The excavation team worked methodically, aware that what lay beneath the soil could finally deliver the answers the Mitchell family had waited decades to hear. Carefully lifting layers of earth, Nolan's team discovered remnants of plastic sheeting, limestone fragments, and other materials meticulously arranged. The placement of these items revealed intent, a deliberate burial, executed to hide a life and its final traces beneath the facade of a thriving garden. Each unearthing intensified the gravity of Bell's actions. This was not an impulsive act. It was a calculated effort to conceal the consequences of a moment's rage. Every folded layer of plastic and every careful mound of soil told the story of someone who believed that time, order, and distance could erase responsibility. The roses above grew oblivious, their roots nourished by silence and decay. Nolan observed quietly, recognizing the contrast, the beauty above and the horror below. The garden's serenity had masked a crime so precise that for 25 years, it had remained invisible to all but the most persistent scrutiny. The juxtaposition was chilling a life hidden under what appeared to be nothing more than a routine landscape. Finally, the remains were uncovered. The discovery was subtle, clinical, yet devastating in its confirmation. Every fragment and trace confirmed the path from Lauren Mitchell's disappearance to this secluded spot. The cardigan, the clay-stained tools, and now the burial, all pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle, were finally aligning. This revelation transformed the investigation from theory into irrefutable fact. Quentin Bell's carefully constructed life had shielded him from suspicion, but the physical evidence refused to lie. The deliberate burial exposed the calculated cruelty and the ego that had guided every decision that night. The scene spoke volumes without words. Beauty and horror intertwined, truth obscured, but ultimately undefeated. The final layer of soil was removed, revealing the full extent of the concealment. The roses above, vibrant and orderly, had unwittingly grown over decades of hidden truth. Their roots fed on soil that had absorbed a crime, nourished by a deliberate attempt to erase Lauren Mitchell's presence from the world. The contrast was stark, the life above blooming while the darkness below remained unnoticed for 25 years. Nolan surveyed the scene, noting the precision in the burial, the plastic sheeting, the careful layering of soil, the positioning of the cardigan all spoke to Bell's obsessive need for control. Every detail reflected a mind accustomed to order, yet twisted by anger and wounded pride. The roses had grown strong over the years, their beauty masking the evidence, but they could not hide the facts forever. This garden, once a symbol of calm, had become a witness to a carefully concealed crime. Each petal, each bloom, seemed to carry a story of what had been silenced. The discovery illuminated the full scope of the killer's calculations. The crime was methodical, the concealment intentional, and the passage of time irrelevant to the truth that had waited to be uncovered. For the Mitchell family, this moment was devastating and clarifying. Lauren's life, her disappearance, and the long wait for justice converged in a single, undeniable revelation. For the investigators, it was a testament to patience, persistence, and the power of evidence that refuses to be ignored. The roses above continued to bloom, their beauty now inseparable from the horror hidden beneath. The garden, a symbol of deliberate concealment, had become a marker of truth, silent, yet unyielding. The truth of that November night finally emerged with stark clarity. Quentin Bell had acted not from desire, not from long-term planning, but from a single, consuming ego wound. Lauren Mitchell's dismissal of his architectural critique, the brief word, the polite refusal to accept his guidance had triggered a rage that spiraled instantly into violence. It was an overreaction born from professional pride, a mind convinced that one slight could erase the years of skill, recognition, and perceived respect he believed he deserved. This revelation reframed the entire narrative. The years of speculation, the suspicion cast on Julian Pierce, and the relentless uncertainty that gripped Des Moines were all consequences of a single act of ego-driven fury. Bell's life of quiet respectability had masked a capacity for violence that waited only for the right catalyst. The forensic evidence, the kaolinite, the tools, the buried cardigan revealed the calculated execution that followed. But the emotional driver was shockingly simple: wounded pride. Detective Nolan summarized the psychological dimensions of the crime. Bell's expertise in construction, his careful manipulation of the apartment environment, and his patience in concealment were remarkable, but they were tools wielded to cover a crime born of impulse. The forensic record captured the consequences of unchecked ego, the echoes of a choice that would haunt families, friends, and a city for decades. Every layer of soil, every smear of clay, and every recovered item told the story of how a minor insult had escalated into life-ending violence. The narrative no longer required imagination. The evidence spoke clearly. With Quentin Bell's confession and the discovery of Lauren Mitchell's remains, the scales of justice began to tip. Julian Pierce, once clouded by suspicion and public judgment, finally received the clarity he had been denied for 25 years. His name cleared, he could reclaim a life that had been derailed by rumors and assumptions. The vindication was not only personal, it was public, restoring his dignity and correcting the distorted narrative that had haunted him. Detective Harlan Cobb, long shadowed by the unsolved case, finally experienced a sense of closure. The failure that had marked his career for decades was replaced with the satisfaction of seeing justice delivered, even if belatedly. The reinvigoration of the investigation by Nolan's team proved that patience, science, and determination could overcome time's obfuscation. For the community of Des Moines, the revelation was seismic. Shock and disbelief rippled through neighborhoods and families who had lived with the ghost of Lauren Mitchell's disappearance. The quiet man, the familiar instructor, the trusted figure in a local profession. These were the faces that had concealed danger in plain sight. People realized that appearances could be deceiving, and that evil could exist within the most ordinary lives. Amid this reckoning, the forensic details, the kaolinite, the clay tools, the carefully buried cardigan stood as immutable witnesses. They spoke louder than testimony or rumor, providing undeniable proof of both the crime and the methodical efforts to conceal it. The evidence outlived human memory, ensuring that truth could not be buried alongside the victim. In the quiet aftermath, Nolan reflected on the lessons the case offered. Justice was never guaranteed, but careful observation, modern techniques, and unwavering commitment to facts could pierce through decades of silence and misdirection. The kaolinite smudge that had seemed insignificant in 1993 became the voice of truth decades later. Every particle, every trace, carried with it the history of the crime. Technology transformed it from an overlooked smudge into an unassailable fingerprint, linking Quentin Bell directly to Lauren Mitchell's disappearance. It was astonishing to consider that a substance so ordinary could hold such extraordinary significance, proof that even the smallest, most overlooked details can expose the darkest secrets. Detective Nolan emphasized the clay's role as an enduring witness. While memories fade and witnesses age, the material evidence persisted. It transcended human error and misjudgment, remaining steadfast even when the investigation went cold. The clay spoke of Bell's movements, his tools, and the precise method he used to conceal his crime. Its story was a reminder that actions, no matter how carefully hidden, leave traces that refuse to vanish. The forensic breakthrough also reshaped the perception of the investigation. What had seemed like luck, chance, or desperation was in reality a testament to methodical persistence. It proved that modern science could rectify decades of uncertainty, that patience and innovation could pierce through time and deception. For the Mitchell family, the clay became more than evidence, it was proof of the truth that had long eluded them. The city of Des Moines, meanwhile, confronted a sobering reality. Appearances could be misleading, and evil could reside in the most unassuming individuals. The clay was silent, yet louder than any confession or courtroom testimony. It reminded investigators and the public alike that the truth often lingers in the most unexpected forms, waiting to be recognized, analyzed, and finally understood. Even after the arrest and recovery of remains, the clay remained a symbol, one that outlasted fear, rumor, and time itself, cementing its place as a witness that could never be ignored. With Quentin Bell behind bars and the evidence irrefutable, the story of Lauren Mitchell reached its final chapter. Justice, delayed for 25 years, had been delivered, but its impact resonated far beyond the courtroom. Julian Pierce, finally cleared of suspicion, could reclaim his life. Detective Harlan Cobb, burdened for decades by an unresolved case, found closure. The community, stunned by the revelation that a trusted figure had committed such a crime, faced the sobering truth that appearances often deceive. Yet the most striking lesson came from the enduring witness. The clay. That small smudge, once dismissed, had outlived memory, rumor, and human error. It was proof that the truth persists, sometimes hidden in plain sight, waiting for the tools, minds, and patience to uncover it. The story of Lauren Mitchell became a testament to vigilance, science, and the persistence of justice, even when decades attempt to bury it. Subscribe to stay ahead of hidden predators. Knowledge is your shield. If you still won't subscribe, comment why we're all listening. Tell us why you ignore these lessons.